The young man remembered the fisherman's son. He remembered the mother and father who raised him, and the sisters who teased him. That boy grew up in a small, forgettable village nestled against the shores of Lake Dantes. Each day he and his father rose before the morning light, tending to nets and fishermen's sails, pressing their little skiff out into that seemingly boundless lake. Through waves, sun, and storms he worked his trade. A diligent eye and a steady heart guided him until the sun retreated below the horizon. This was the only life he'd ever known, even as he dreamed of more. Each morning he went out with his father, and each evening he returned. The days bled from one to the other, and to another. The seasons passed. Spring blossomed into the summer. Summer disappeared into the fall. Winter raised its head with a bone-biting chill. It was as the lake froze and their work ceased that his family settled in against the snowfalls. That was the time the boy cherished most. Winter's cold brought evening tales of valiant knights and captive princesses. His father's eyes shined, and his voice hummed with vitality as he told his stories by firelight. He spoke of the capital city of Cavriola and the land of patron Garcia, places the boy had never seen. As his father wove his tales and the boy listened, his eyes wandered far to the south, his thoughts to the capital city in the distance and the patron's palace. There the stories told him were white spires so tall and graceful that they kissed the very sky. It was in those bleak evenings that he pressed closer to the fire and forgot the hunger in his stomach. His heart rose with his father's words as he heard of great men doing even greater things. As his eyes stared out beyond those dreary wattle and daub walls, he dreamed of a better life. Down there in the far south, he would fight and find his glory. There he would be celebrated. There he would meet his princess. But time has its own intentions, as obscure as the will of the dragon gods. Life is lived, and the path a person walks along it is never so straight as expected. The evening was almost full darkness. The thin sliver of a new dragon moon offered little light against a clouded sky. But even under that sickly light, he could make out the fleet of dark-sailed ships in the distant port. From his hilltop perch just below the palace, he could see the hundreds of torches among the thousands of Thardan soldiers who poured off of them. They were setting the city ablaze. It was the start of an invasion. Lifeless eyes stared up at him, frozen expression of shock as that young man wrested his sword from the man's chest. The corpse slid to the ground and lay motionless. His hand was trembling. His whole body was trembling. Buildings burned on either side of a city street as the intense smell of smoke filled his nostrils. It had been an ambush, a carefully planned and executed slaughter. The once fisherman's son was no longer a boy. He was a soldier, standing in the startling moment of his own creation. His eyes fell to the corpses of the Thardan infiltrators surrounding him. They were dressed in the clothes of tradesmen and peasants, while in their dead hands they held their weapons of war. Fixed to their arms, on a small strip of cloth, was the emblem of the burning eagle. Beside them and among them lay the bodies of the palace guards they'd been ordered to kill. And to that end, they had succeeded. But that had not been the only task placed at their feet.
Hello? Hello?
The lone survivor cried out with a quaking edge of uncertainty to her voice. She waved her hands wildly in front of her. The young man stood on that city street, taking one deep breath after another, his whole body shaking. His mind was a racing mess of incomplete thoughts and confused fear. He had done something that he never thought he would.
Hello?
The wounded royal cried out against her newly found darkness.
Is anyone else there? Bertrand? Elaine? Does anyone else live?
Another deep breath. He continued to stare down at that body, but didn't truly see it. He could feel the man's blood on his hands, drying under the burning fires and starting to stick. That he was aware of. He just needed time to digest everything that had happened, even as he was aware of how little of it he really had. There was guilt in his heart, but also revelry. How was he supposed to make sense of that?
Please. Someone, anyone, say something.
The woman cried.
Is there anyone else alive?
Those desperate words grasped at his attention and pulled him back to the present. He turned to the one other survivor with a grimace. Patron Garcia's daughter, Princess Lucia, knelt huddled and shaking in the ruins of her toppled carriage. Her once fine dress was muddied and ripped. The Thardan infiltrators had beaten her across her face and torso. A slash mark ran across her almond-shaped eyes in a bright red ribbon of flesh and blood. He remembered how she crawled piteously on the ground, as that one invading soldier had mocked her, cursed her, and kicked at her. He wanted to run from her, leave her to the will of the dragon god Fluky. It was certainly the easiest thing to do. There was drama and incomprehensible hazard in taking her on. Far less in moving away from her, far easier to survive. The professional soldiers on those black-sailed ships were coming. But even knowing that, his legs remained stubbornly rooted to the ground, refusing to move away. He swallowed that hard truth, sheathed his sword, and gathered his thoughts into words. He willed his steps through the carnage between them, and his legs obeyed. He approached the lonely, sightless woman, quivering among the cobbled stones of the city street. Princess Lucia, there is one person still alive. Her head turned suddenly to the sound of his voice.
Who are you?
I'm a soldier in your father's army.
I can't see you.
Her hands rose to her battered face, and then gestured to an empty space in front of her.
They took it. Those monsters took my sight from me. Are you telling me the truth?
Caustic words came first to his mind, but the young man held them back as better judgment. I'm gonna get you out of here. She carefully reached her hands up, as if trying to confirm his very presence. In the empty space, they wavered cautiously.
I don't recognize your voice. My guards. Do any of them live? Are you really the only one?
They're dead. Every single one of them. He replied after a pause, grasping firmly at her offered hand. I'm the only one still here. The grip the princess returned was solid and strong, as she nodded her head in understanding. Her anguish showed in quiet gasps as her head fell to the ground. The buildings continued to burn around them, as the young man looked on silently. The grief she bore seemed almost genuine to him. Princess Lucia, he insisted.
I knew them. I knew all of them. Vitogh and Elaine, Claudio, Bertrand, and Goyo.
The young man pulled out a knife from his hip and cut a length of cloth from one of the nearby corpses. There isn't time for that, he said as he approached her, laying his hands upon her face. Lucia turned her head up to him with a startle, but relaxed some small measure as he used the soot-smattered cloth to wrap around her head and cover the wound along her eyes. The whole of her body shuddered against his not unkind touch. He finished the wrapping with a tight knot. The bandage was hardly clean, but was better than leaving the wound exposed. He ignored her tears and her cries. All the suffering she'd endured had broken in this small gesture of kindness. The invaders will be making their way to the palace, and there aren't many soldiers left to stop them. We need to go, he said.
What's your name, warrior? Might I know who my savior is?
The answer brought a hesitant pause to his lips, wondering whether to lie. But he thought better of it. My name is Gabriel, he replied.
Gabriel.
She repeated with a sightless nod as she pulled on his arm and stood on quivering legs.
I will put my faith in you then.
He stood a moment further with a deep sigh. His eyes were drawn to the palace at the very top of the hill, one last time. Its tall white spires stood brightly against the dark night sky. There were still soldiers there, but they were a quarter of the numbers they should have been. Patron Garcia was away with most of them on one of his many campaigns. Those foolish troops stood their final watch, only waiting to die. Gabriel remembered the fisherman's son like a distant and half-forgotten dream. He was a deserter, and those white spires looked gray and stilted against the evening sky. All he felt was emptiness looking at them now. The young man turned back to the hand grasped tightly in his, and the charge that stood beside him, waiting. He wondered where they could run. It was enough for him to know that they couldn't stay. Come on, time to move on, he said as much to himself as the princess. As he walked determinedly away from the bloodshed of the ambush, she followed behind him. Where were your guards taking you? Is there an escape that I don't know of? Gabriel had asked her.
There's a small river harbor that feeds into the Gataconis. It's far from the main port and gates. Bertrand thought it was the best place to go.
She had told him. Gabriel knew the place, but not well. It gave him some hope. It was 2 leagues away from where they were. Perhaps a little more. It was certainly better than anything else he could think of. The two of them would get on some small boat with whatever supplies they could easily find and head downriver. That was their plan. He wanted to run. He wanted to run with all the speed he could muster, but he soon learned the limits of what the princess could do. His arm guided her as best it could, but it wasn't enough to make up for the lack of her sight. Her feet caught on stones that Gabriel saw to step over. Her body struck against fallen cups and shattered wares he was able to avoid. She'd cry out to him, and he jarringly turned to her.
I'm sorry. I'll do better, I promise.
Those were the words that he heard more than he cared to. Still, there were no demands of royal entitlement or cries of self-pity from her. It helped in stealing back the frustration. Their pace was a determined walk, but could be no faster. He held his tongue and carried on. In the face of that dogged pace, the fires from the invading army spread steadily. A quarter of the city declared their presence in rumbling blazes. The smell of smoke was everywhere. The sound of fighting echoed up the great hilltop and gained in strength as the two of them descended. The tall, terraced buildings gave way to smaller structures and huddled dwellings as they pulled further away from the palace neighborhood. There was a path he knew well enough along the shadowed corridor of Carpenter Street. His intention was to avoid as many people as he could, though the young man learned quickly enough the limits to which that could be done. There were small gatherings of terrified people everywhere. Some fled past them, disappearing in one direction or another, paying them no attention. Others took to shuttered houses and hid behind bolted doors. The streets were filled with hastily lost belongings, broken and stampeded objects abandoned by their owners. The two of them continued on as fast as they could through the crowded emptiness as the small river harbor beckoned. They moved down the long streets painfully slow as Gabriel continued to fight back his frustration. He wondered again what he was doing taking her with him. Soon a closer and more distinct sound drew his attention. From around the near corner, he could hear metal clinking against metal in a soft, even cadence. Soldiers approached at a marching trot, and they were coming towards them.
Gabriel!
The princess coughed. "Not now," he whispered between a thundering heart and the firm set of his jaw. He shoved her into the shadows of a nearby doorway, hiding his sword and pressing his body between her and the open street. Gabriel took a deep breath reflexively and held it, hoping not to be seen. The soldiers marched past. Whatever cause drew them down that road was dire enough to ignore the two of them. They disappeared around a further bend. The sound of their progress shivered slowly back, lost against the sounds of the rest of the city. Gabriel exhaled.
What was it? Who were they?
Lucia asked. "No one important," he replied firmly. His hand reached for hers and gripped it tightly. "Come on. Can't be much more than a league left to the river." She hesitated as her head flitted back the way the soldiers had gone. He pulled forcefully at her arm as fire rose in his voice. "Come on! The longer we stay anywhere, the more danger we face. If Thardis' main force cut off our route to the river, we're probably not going to get out of here." She turned to him, sighed, and nodded slowly.
You're right.
She said with defeat in her voice.
Lead on.
Carpenter Street turned into the causeway. The causeway was closer to the raging din of fighting. It was one of the many places that the spreading fires had reached. Thick smoke roiled against the barely perceived breeze coming inland. Gabriel halted some moment on the last corner before the wide thoroughfare. He could see the bright shifting orange light that blazed down their shadowed corridor. He could feel the heat of the fires. He could hear people screaming, a chorus of cries almost as loud as the battle roars of fighting soldiers. Gabriel thought he could hear some of that, too. The young man peeked his head around the corner to get a better view of what he was entering. Buildings on either side of the street were ablaze, and the fires were spreading fast. There was a small Thardan force fighting with city soldiers further down the road, and among them were a great many people fleeing in all directions. They appeared to have been caught in the conflict, with few places to go. Gabriel's gaze extended some few blocks further down towards Marker Pass. Beyond the fighting and fleeing, he could just make out the turn away from all of it. Beyond that was a straight shot to the river wharf and their escape. Soldiers were fighting and people were dying along the path they needed to cross. It was 3 blocks of falling rubble and chaos, with every extra moment exposed to the worst of it. They had to get through that, and he couldn't run with the princess. The young man stole a hesitant glance at the woman behind him, the eyes tightly covered in a strip of cloth, her face darkened by sweat, smoke, and the splatter of death. In the flailing orange light of the fire, she looked frail and felt like a burden. He'd become a deserter, a soldier certainly, but nothing more than that. What am I doing? He wondered again. He didn't know the answer. Only that he was doing this. Only that he had to do it. Why, though? The whole act felt foolish. He'd figure that one out later. His body shook as he gripped tightly at her hand. He felt a small measure of reassurance as the princess returned it. He fixed his eyes firmly on his destination. Gabriel took a deep breath and exhaled. He drew his sword and rounded the corner onto the causeway. The immense, violent cacophony of those long city blocks stood and embraced him high. The great fires burned around him. People cried their fears in the dark and empty night. He continued on. A building illuminated in turbulent orange and yellow, collapsing in on itself with a thundering clatter. The buildings surrounding it burned as hot as an inferno. He continued on. A child knelt in bawling despair alone on the street, crying for her parents as he and others pressed by and ignored her. He continued on. Here and there, the body of a city soldier or commoner lay ravaged and motionless on the ground or against a structure. The blood of the dead and wounded ran plainly against the street. He continued on. Deep within, he fought the distractions of a city falling to pieces around him. It was all just impersonal violence. The other Thardan infiltrators succeeded in their main task. Cavriola was falling to pieces. There was nothing he could do about that. There was only where he had to go and what might try to stop him. As the fires burned and people screamed, as blade struck to blade and shield and armor, he was just one man trying to get through it. His head roved continuously over the tumult as he guided the princess along at a painful, slow pace. There was one hurried step in front of the other as that feminine arm jolted and followed behind him. It stumbled once or twice, but he righted it. Again, and thankfully, the people coursing around ignored him. And then a stranger stumbled around the corner of a burning building, stained sword in hand, belying his commoner's clothes. Gabriel saw the painted emblem of the burning eagle tied around his arm. The Thardan infiltrator turned his head to the young man and started. A flash of recognition beamed in the invader's face. He released his grip on the princess's hand, and in a blink closed the distance between them. The man raised his sword up, but Gabriel parried it, and plunged his blade through the man's chest. The infiltrator gasped, and faltered to his knees as blood poured from the wound. The familiar shock in those dead eyes stared up at him. Gabriel started as again he recognized what he had done. He'd acted on reflex. He stood there some moments as the fires burned around him, as that realization slowly sank in. There was fresh blood on his hands, so much of the wrong kind of blood. His body shook with that too familiar strain of guilt. The young man freed his blade with a kick against the dead figure. The fires continued to rage around him, the heat almost unbearable. There was screaming voices and clanging steel against steel. His breath was heavy and painful against the thick smoke. He felt a deep and dark doubt flooding through his heart. In some further breaths, he at last remembered the princess as he turned back behind him. She was on her knees, waving her hands wildly out in the space in front of her, lost in a sea of violent light and chaos. People ran past her, they sought their own safety. The fighting continued down the street away from the both of them. Gabriel sheathed his blade and raced back to her, pushing the waving hands away and lifting her over his shoulders. She groaned in the act. He was sweating, scared and tired, but he moved with a determined step. There was only a block left to their turn. He carried her at a labored trot as he hacked and coughed against the billowing smoke. His eyes burned and teared as he stepped around cindered planks and shattered rubble. The fire continued to roar about him, but he barely registered it as his aching legs pressed on to that hidden turn. There was twice the blood on his hands. There was what he had chosen to do. He rounded the bend and continued to carry her. The coolness of the shadows welcomed him. He pressed on in a startling fervor. The fires and violence were at his back, and disappearing as he pressed further down the side pathway. The sounds of violence dissipated, and still he kept going. His legs strained as the weight of the woman on his shoulders seemed to grow heavier.
Gabriel, I can hear your labored breath.
Princess Lucia said from over his back.
I don't feel the fires anymore. I think we're safe. You can put me down.
Marker Pass lay just ahead of them. The river wharf was not so far away.
nothing is quite what it seems. So there are, little things that I hope that I peppered throughout the story that at least should suggest, without giving an answer to, that things are not quite as seems. The story is not quite as generic as it might, appear. That concept of boy dreams of being a hero and how's the outcome. Maybe even more so than you hope, but that's only if I did it right, and maybe I'm giving away too many suggestions by doing that. In any case, if you've made it this far, I'd like to believe that you've liked my story, and if you haven't, God bless you for staying this far anyway. This is a bit of a passion project for me. This is like the first story in like a series of like 6 or 7, which is kind of developing this world and these characters that I've kind of created. The world of like a carton, which there should be a map popping up right now on my right-hand side about that. And the idea is that, you build up a relationship with this world, and then unto this they came. Unto this, the protagonists ultimately did come. And that's really the big thing that I'm kind of trying to do about it. The idea, I think, behind a lot of that fantasy fiction that I try to do is trying to find, the right balance. I grew up with a lot of the tropes. I know all of the fantasy tropes. I gobbled up fantasy fiction like a beast when I was younger. I kind of, petered out further on. And as I've come back to, trying to read fantasy fiction, I find that it kind of sits on, either one end of the spectrum or another, where it's just on one end you have the YA stuff where everything works out and everything's hunky-dory, and through a series of ridiculous coincidences and plot armor, the world is happy and hero wins, yada yada yada. And then on the other end of it you got the world is dark and depressing, and I'm gonna let you know how it's dark and depressing, and it doesn't matter if the world isn't really that dark and depressing. I want you to know what it is. And for me, that's just kind of, doing the same issue but on the other side of it. And so what I'm looking for is kind of that sort of balance with stuff. Hopefully stick with me for the next one, just the conclusion of the story, and hopefully there's some good surprises with that. And hopefully there's ample information for you the opportunity to, get a sense of the different voice actors, artists, and musicians who, contributed their momentous talents to, this little passion project of mine. Once again, if you're liking it, please like, comment, subscribe. Check me out on Instagram. You're going to find a lot of cool information, added stuff about the world itself, the process of me commissioning these artists, and I think that's really about it. And I guess to that end, I will offer a toast. Salud. And I hope to see you on the next one. Peace.